This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Dahlia Shenlin without Gilad Halpern this time. Every week we bring you conversations with authors and their books and research and things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom, click the big red button that says Patreon and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's part of our new series on democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends around the world. And all good democracies, or most, well, many at least, start with a constitution. Therefore, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Hanna Lerner today. Hanna is a senior lecturer at Tel Aviv University's Political Science Department. She did her PhD at Columbia University, held visiting fellowships at Princeton and at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Proper disclosure, she was also my lecturer when I was a doctoral student at Tel Aviv University. Hanna's research focuses on comparative constitution writing, particularly in societies divided by religion and identity, as well as democratic theory, global justice, and international labor rights. Among numerous articles, Dr. Lerner is the author of Making Constitutions in Deeply Divided Societies from 2011, and more recently, she co-authored the book Constitution Writing, Religion, and Democracy with Asla Bali, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. We'll be focusing on this and other articles. Hanna Lerner, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
At one point, you and Asla refer to constitution making as a high-stakes exercise. But some people hear constitution writing and think it sounds pretty dry. Why is it high stakes to the point where some people have even been killed over this process, like in Nepal in 2016? Why is the process of writing a constitution so important and so fraught?
That's a really good question. I think that the importance of constitutions is a big question, and there might be conflicting views on whether it's important or not. I think some people view constitutions with high expectations that it would solve all the political problems. It will promote rule of law. It would promote democracy. It would protect human rights. It would allow policy changes in the right direction. The right direction according to their views.
So it's going to save us.
So it's going to save us all. But I think in many ways, these expectations are pretty overrated. And I think constitutions are mostly viewed by legal scholars and lawyers as the most important document of the country, of the basic norm of the democracy, according to Kelsen, which is one of the most important scholars of law in the 20th century. But it's mostly should be viewed, and that's the main argument that Asla and myself had tried to promote in our book. It should be viewed from the political standpoint as a political document.
As opposed to a legal document.
As opposed to a legal document. And as a political document, it could be controversial, and it could actually create problems and exacerbate conflicts rather than solve them.
And you're talking about that might be the case, especially in societies that are divided.
Right.
Is that correct? Or is that different from societies where there are not as deep social divisions? Can you distinguish between countries that have really deeply divided societies, as the scholar Arend Leipart calls them, or societies that are not that divided?
Yeah. So there are different theories about the distinctions or the definitions of deeply divided societies. We distinguish between societies that are heterogenic. All societies are heterogenic in the sense that they are composed of different cultures, different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different types of identity. But some societies around the world, some countries around the world are, despite this heterogeneity, still share some common consensus, some common basic norms, and a general agreement about the basic norms according to which their state should function, and according to which the state should legislate their laws, and the democracy should function. And on the other side, there are heterogenic societies or heterogenic countries or multicultural countries where there are deep divisions on the very basic norms and very basic values that underpin the state. So, for example, values according to which the family should be constructed, or the very basic norms according to which identity should be understood. And I think in general, I mean, it used to be the case that we divided the distinction between those more liberal countries like Western Europe or North America, where there was some general consensus around liberal values. And I define liberalism in a very basic sense of accepting the distinction between my own identity, cultural, religious, or ethnic identity, and the general sort of public identity, or the general identity that should underpin the public sphere and the state as a whole. So in more liberal societies that tend to be more liberal, this sort of distinction between the public and the private identity is more accepted. In deeply divided societies, this distinction is less accepted.
And you have groups that may wish to have their identity be the dominant one, fused with the state identity.
Exactly.
But competing groups.
Exactly. So people do not accept the idea or the fact that they can live their own life according to their own religious or cultural traditions, but they try to impose their own values, their own norms, their own way of living on the society as a whole. And then the clash is much more severe.
Let me ask you, just want to sort of back up chronologically to start the conversation. You point out that there are lots of constitution writing processes going on over the last 30 years. That you write that over the last 30 years, more than half of all countries in the world have written or rewritten their constitutions, which is why it seems like we hear about constitutional processes on the news almost as much as elections. Why this growing, increasing pace or frequency of constitution writing and rewriting over the last 30 years?
Yeah, that's correct. I think we live in what some scholars have called the age of constitution making. And as we said earlier, a lot of political actors are trying to solve, or a lot of political problems are attempted to be solved by drafting a new constitution or rewriting a new constitution. It's part of this sort of general expectation that the constitution, again, will save us, that law will save us. And I think it's part of this general trend that is pretty much global. So it's part of this larger trend
of judicialization, which you did write about also,
right?
Which is a very tense issue here in Israel. What do you mean when you talk about judicialization of politics?
It means that more and more political issues are being transferred from the political sphere or political arena into the judicial arena, and more cases are being thrown into the hands of the Supreme Courts or constitutional courts rather than being solved through the political system.
Well, this is such a landmine question here in Israel that it's tempting to go down that rabbit hole. I mean, I'll just stop with one quick question about it and then we'll move back. Do you see that trend as a pernicious invasion of the legal system in the countries that you have in mind? And you can give us examples of those countries. Or do you think that this is the fault of the political system not wanting to solve those problems? Because the accusation among many right-wing circles is that the legal system has encroached and invaded in territory where they don't belong. Do you agree with that as a scholar, as a researcher?
From what I see, and from other comparative studies that have been done on this area, usually lawyers do not, or judges do not jump into this sort of pool of cold or hot water, depending on the definition. The political conflict are sort of hot potatoes that are being thrown around from some drafting of the constituent assemblies that draft constitutions into future generations or future political institutions and I can give examples, but also from the political system, parliaments, into the hands of judges. And I think most often judges are kind of trying to fill a vacuum rather than attempt to, step in.
So we're not witnessing a judicial takeover of the world.
No. I think political actors should look very honestly into their actions. And in many ways, the constitutions are not drafted by judges. I mean, the constitutions are drafted, and especially constitutions that allow or empower courts and expand the role of courts in the political system. These documents are written by politicians.
That's a good point to remember. Where are some of the other countries where this is an issue, where this is becoming a question?
Yeah, so Israel is by far not the only place where
Thank you for reminding us that we are not the only one.
Yeah, of course not. It's part of a general trend, a general conflict. I mean, we see it across the world. Most scholars, most political and legal scholars in Israel try to compare Israel to the Western world and to Western democracy. But if you look at the kind of political problems that Israel is facing, and you look at the kind of political conflicts, cultural, religious, ethnic conflicts, and even institutional conflicts that the Israeli political system is facing, I think it's much more relevant to compare Israel to non-Western countries, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and even countries around the Middle East that are going through processes of democratization, and where religious issues and conflicts around religious or ethnic or national issues are part of the public and legal and political debate. So, and a good example that I've written extensively about is India, for example, that is going through, by the way, a long and complicated process of elections.
Elections are always long and complicated when you have close to 1 billion people or over 1 billion
Right.
people.
I think they have 900 million voters.
But tell us about this, because I think this is really, one of the most fascinating things about your research is the question of what is a society divided by religious identity, which is the main focus of a lot of your work. How does that overlap with other ethnic and identity-related divisions where there is some scholarship, but as you claim, not enough scholarship on the issue of religious divides? How do those identity groups interact? What's the relationship between ethnic division, religious division, national division?
Yeah. So there are several issues here. One is the definition of religious conflicts, and religion in general is a very complicated concept to, of course, define. What we did in our book that you mentioned on constitution writing and religion, we looked at 14 different countries where religion was part of the main debate during the constitution drafting process.
Tell us some of them.
So we looked at especially non-Western countries, India, Indonesia, Japan, Senegal, and many Middle Eastern countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Israel. It's a sample,
just to whet our
we had
listeners' appetite.
Two European countries, Germany and Norway. And one of the interesting questions that we asked ourselves was how do we define religious conflicts? In many countries, religious identity sort of overlaps with ethnic identity, sometimes even with geographical or distinctions. So, for example, in Turkey, which is another case in the book, the sort of secular religious conflict overlaps with the periphery versus sort of more central urban divisions.
And secular religious isn't necessarily only about the tension between secular people and religious people, but the different religious groups themselves. So there's different layers of religious conflict.
Right, exactly,
as well.
And different intensity of conflict in some, and also there's distinction between the different religions. I mean, in some cases, symbolism plays a major role. In some cases, it's about legislation, marriage and divorce, etc. In some cases, like, for example, and that's the case in many Islamic majority countries.
What do you mean by that? Symbolism plays a big role. In other cases, it's more about family law.
So in some countries, like especially around the Middle East, but also in India, for example, the regulation of marriage and divorce is a major political controversy.
Like in Israel.
Like in Israel, of course. That's why comparison is sort of
helpful.
Helpful, exactly. So in India, for example, during the 3 years of drafting a constitution between 1946 and 1949, exactly when in Israel the Knesset decided not to draft a constitution, the Indian Constituent Assembly, which also, by the way, played a double role as a Constituent Assembly and as the first legislature, like in Israel. During 3 years, they've debated the content of the Indian Constitution. Not once they doubted their task of drafting a constitution.
Oh, unlike Israel.
They didn't
even consider stopping the process and saying we can't do this.
No, despite major political problems, despite partition of the country during the debate. So the
incredible
Constituent
violence.
Assembly right, started drafting constitution 7 months before the partition of the country between India and Pakistan. And India is, as you know, the largest democracy in the world, but also the most divided, the most diverse democracy in the world in terms of the composition of, again, religious groups, ethnic groups, socioeconomic divisions, etc. So the role of religion, the place of religion in the Constitution and the definition of what it means to be an Indian. Does it mean, what is an Indian? Is Indian means being Hindu, or can Muslim be Indian as well? So the sort of overlap or the relationship between the religious identity and the national or civic identity was a major, major issue that was debated during those 3 years. And the main sort of idea that Nehru, the first prime minister and one of the leaders of the Constituent Assembly, was trying to promote was unity without uniformity. So being Indian, he explained in his wonderful book, by the way, The Discovery of India, where he wrote this book while being in jail. He wrote the book for his daughter, describing his travels across India and sort of discovering what it means to be an Indian, meeting all the different sort of variety of groups and people around the country. And there, I think he actually invented the idea of multiculturalism in the deep sort of real sense of the term, trying to promote through the Constitution a unified legal system and a unified sort of legal and political identity without trying to impose a unified religious or ethnic or national identity alongside. And just to complete this, so the religion played a role in this case in many examples. One of them was, one of the specific questions that was debated was how to regulate family law. Should family law be regulated according to the different traditions and the different religious groups? Each,
so basically, sort of legal family pluralism, law be religious law.
But also legal pluralism. So each religious group will follow their own legal tradition.
But would that have meant that there was no option for civil personal law?
Right. So under the British rule, there was the British option. But then what happens in the new independent country, there were major debates around this question. Some of the more Hindu nationalists actually wanted to there was a variety of groups. Some wanted to secularize completely family law. Some wanted to preserve the system as it is, legal pluralism. The Muslim groups some of their leaders wanted to preserve their sort of unique, tradition and feared that secularizing family law would actually mean homogenizing culturally and oppressing their own sort of tradition and groups. So there were major different groups. Eventually what the drafters decided is to include the idea of a uniform civil code in the Constitution, but they included it in a part that is defined as non-justiciable.
Well, this is one of the most interesting things that I think comes up in your research, is that various aspects of the Indian Constitution can never be enforced.
Right.
But in a way, you claim that was one of the things that made it possible to have this Constitution. Am I correct? Or was it a mechanism or a tool for helping it succeed?
Right. I think that this is one of the brilliant aspects of the Indian Constitution and the debates around the Constitution, which are, by the way, accessible online and fascinating to read. The leaders of the Constituent Assembly understood that this is a political document. They think very deeply understood the task that they're facing. On the one hand, they needed to unify the country, a vast, vast country that had to also incorporate into the political system over 560 princely states that were actually completely independent. I mean, we're not even under British rule. So they had to sort of build this sort of legal framework for all these major diverse people, but at the same time, they understood the limitations of this legal document and that they cannot, not every social reform can be promoted through these legal means. So they've created a constitution that, as one of my colleagues, when I told him the story, he said, "Oh, this is like a Swiss cheese constitution." So constitution with holes. Some aspects that were deeply controversial, and especially around identity issues, were just left undecided.
Incrementally decided on later.
We're sort of passed on to future generation and future institutions to decide upon them, whether it's future parliaments or future courts. My favorite example is on the question of language. So one of the main debates was about what would be the national language of India.
We wouldn't know anything about that debate here in Israel.
Right, exactly. So in India, in 1947, when it became independent, the population was around 200 million people. More than 20 languages were spoken by more than 1 million people. Some census counted 1,600 different mother tongues.
It's really mind-boggling. We just have, two peoples here, Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. How hard could it be? But, okay, keep going, because I want to find out how they managed to make order out of this.
So, by the way, the next multilinguistic democracy is, I think, Switzerland with 4 languages. So
that's a big gap.
Exactly. There's no one language that is spoken by the majority of the population. So Hindi is spoken by only 40% of the population. So there's no sort of main language that can be, defined as the national language. And there was a major debate for 3 years what would be the national language. At the end, the decision of the drafters was and that's the provision that was included in the Constitution, the decision was that in 15 years, the parliament will create a committee that will decide what would be the national language of India. I call it a Mapainik decision.
Well, your friend calls it Swiss cheese. I call it a cop-out. Why is this a good thing, this incrementalism?
Just in the meantime, Hindi was defined as the official language, not formal language, and English was defined as sort of the language of governance. So it was the overarching kind of linguistic tool that tied India together, and the Constitution also recognized 18 different languages that can be used in the different provinces, and the boundaries of the provinces were defined according to linguistic sort of boundaries. So what this decision made was basically to take the linguistic conflict off the political agenda and just kind of pushed it into the future generations, into the future parliament. And meanwhile, the main task was to strengthen the democratic institutions, to strengthen the economy, to achieve all those much more urgent goals that the Indian government had in mind, land reform. I mean, they had major developmental issues, of course, too.
Well, it seems like, when you look at this case, which is certainly a fascinating case in general and for comparison, but you also examine cases like Egypt and Nepal and Sri Lanka, and it seems like one of your common conclusions is that we should not expect constitutions to resolve the problems of creating an identity and a shared, culture around that. Do we have too high expectations of constitutions if we expect that to happen? Would you say, and do you think the Indian case proves why we should not place such rigid expectations on a constitution?
Yeah, I think one of the main differences between solving conflicts through constitution making and solving it through other political means is that when you draft a constitution, you need to choose words. I mean, it's black letter sort of law. You select specific words, you put them on a piece of paper, and each word is sort of carries a baggage of ideology and memories and symbolism. And sometimes this exercise of sort of the need to actually write very specific words on a piece of paper, you bring people who don't agree on basic values and basic norms and basic principles of how the country should be organized and run. If you force them to select specific provisions and specific wording for their ideas, this exercise sometimes exacerbates conflicts rather than solves it. While in other there are other political means. politics is often, the sort of art of being indecisive and vague, and ambiguous and creative about ideas. It allows more space for change, and it allows more space for, I think, resolutions, especially when the conflicts are so controversial and run so deep into identity issues.
I mean, I consider politics to be basically war by other means, so to speak. So the question is, what kind of political mechanism contains conflict, violent conflict? I mean, what you're saying is that some of these identity negotiations are better worked out in the political sphere. But would you say that a constitution or political mechanisms are both help contain these kinds of conflicts that so easily turn violent? Or would you say a constitutional process may drive people to violence, like what happened in Nepal?
Yeah, exactly. Constitutions are different than ordinary laws in two respects. So they're considered higher law. If there's a conflict between a constitutional principle and an ordinary legislation, usually the ordinary legislation should fit and be regulated or passed according to the higher principles of constitution making. They're also usually, not always, but usually more entrenched and more difficult to change. For that reason, that's the sort of mechanism that creates these higher expectations of constitutions, that if we'll only solve the problem through a constitution, which is also, in a way, kind of there's this sort of sometimes an illusion and an idea, if we'll only write a really good contract, all the problems will be solved. But political problems, and especially, again, around identity issues, cannot be resolved through a good contract or through, a very kind of appropriate selection of provisions and words. And that's why I think the incrementalist approach that Asli and I have been written about sometimes is more appropriate, because it allows vagueness and ambiguous principles to be introduced into formal constitutions, sort of the Swiss cheese constitution, as we call it. In some countries, there are even conflicted provisions within constitutions. So some provisions conflict each other, and they are introduced intentionally into the constitution. So in the Tunisian constitution, for example, there are conflicting provisions about the role of Islam, or the definition of, the country. Is it Islamic? Is it secular? What is exactly the place or the protection of women's rights in the Constitution? It's not exactly clear and can be interpreted in different ways. Different provisions may suggest different aspects or different views on these issues. And I think it's okay that they're left there. I mean, there's expectation that the Constitution will be all clear and all present only one side of the ideology or the worldview of only one camp, I think is mistaken and may create more problems and more conflict under specific circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, you do talk about the idea that a lot of the literature about constitutions is based on these Western liberal societies, and I appreciate very much that you gave your definition of what you mean by liberal societies. So would you argue that there should be a different premise for how to approach constitutions and our expectations of them if we're looking at societies that do not start from Western liberal premises, political premises?
Yeah. I have to say, I would like to add the reservation to this distinction of Western, non-Western.
Okay.
When I started working on this project, I think most of the literature on constitutions was very much focused on Western society. So the U.S. Constitution was seen as sort of the
paradigm for everything.
The paradigm.
Because it's working so well in the U.S.
Exactly.
And nothing needs to be changed.
Exactly. And, there were, libraries of books on the American Constitution. That was the role model for the rest of the world. A little bit of other Western European countries, almost nothing about non-Western countries. This has changed a little bit in recent years. When I wrote my first book on the Indian, that included research on the Indian Constitution, there was only one other book on the Indian Constitution. Now there are many more, and I think the world is sort of starts to understand the relevance and the really beauty and the great ideas that were promoted and sort of proposed by the Indian drafters for other countries and other places around the world, and more relevant to contemporary, I think, actually, project of constitution writing. But the irony is that over the last, I would say, 15 years that I've been researching these issues, the distinction between Western and non-Western is sort of much smaller, I think, than it used to be. I mean, we see that deeply divided societies, I mean, the way we define deeply divided societies may fit
in America.
Right, the United States
I'm very happy
today.
you said that because I feel like I stand corrected in a way that reflects what I really meant, which is that it seems to me that many of the Western societies share the very deep, fundamental clash of worldviews and values that, in the societies that you were talking about that are divided by religion and ethnicity, and it just manifests itself in different ways.
Right. So, what's interesting is that if in the past the non-Western world, so Asian countries or Middle Eastern countries, were sort of expected by scholars who advised them to sort of look at the Western models and especially the U.S. Constitution as sort of a role model for their Constitution, I think today a lot of sort of Western countries, and especially the U.S., may benefit from looking at solutions and ideas that are part of the Asian constitution-making projects especially. And again, I think India is a great, great case.
Well, I mean, I have to say that it makes it sound like you're not terribly supportive of reaching a constitution here in Israel, because as listeners probably know, we don't have one. We have a very incremental process because of that failure of the original Constituent Assembly. And I want to ask you your opinion about some of those attempts. I mean, the most recent and most controversial such attempt was the passing of the Basic Law in July of 2018, the nation-state law. I'm not really sure what my question is, other than does this, what's as a constitutional scholar, do you think this is a manifestation of one of those helpful tools of incrementalism in identity formulation in a divided society, or would you say this is not what you had in mind? And maybe you think Israel doesn't need to reach a constitution, but what's your perspective on the nation-state law, given given your comparative research?
Well, first of all, I think that the question whether Israel has a constitution or not is not so clear. I mean, the answer to the question. In many respects, Israel does have a written constitution. We have a set of basic laws that are considered higher laws compared to ordinary legislation. They're entrenched. There's a Supreme Court with power of judicial review that can strike down laws
for the meantime
that are not. Yeah. So I mean, Israel. That's part. That's the constitutional revolution that Aaron Barak sort of celebrated. That turned Israel into a constitutional democracy in many respects. It's true that the constitution is not complete. It's true that the constitution is not written in one formal document, as in the U.S. case. But we have other countries with a constitution, but not a written constitution, such as the UK, for example. So now to the question of the nation-state law, which is the recent sort of addition to the Israeli constitution. I think one of the main problems with this law is that it does exactly the opposite of trying to resolve an identity conflict. I mean, it's a victory of one side of the conflict. It's a political legislation. I always tell my students, since constitutions are a political document, one way of understanding what is the meaning or what was the motivation behind a specific provision or part of the Constitution is to look at who are the people who try to promote it. Because the legal language is sometimes tricky and sometimes vague, and it's not always,
many Israelis looked at that law, even read it, and said, I don't really see the problem. But you're saying there was an intention behind the people who enacted that law.
Right, and there was a very specific political group that pushed for this legislation with a very, specific agenda. And as we could see with the big demonstrations that occurred after the legislation of the law this basic law didn't take into account the feelings or identity of about 20% of the population of this country.
Is there a way to do that, or should we just not touch the issue, ideally, in Israel's basic laws? The issue of identity, of course.
I think under the current circumstances, hadn't the basic law was not passed, if we can go back in time to June last summer, yes, I think that would be the right answer. Ruth Gavison wrote a major report on this issue, and I think she was correct. She recommended, so Tzipi Livni appointed her to write a report and propose sort of a more consensus-based nation-state law. And her conclusion was that you could not formulate a consensus-based nation-state law under the current circumstances, under the current political situation and the current sort of identity, divisions in Israel. And I think she was correct.
Well, Hanna, you certainly offer a lot of tools for how to write a constitution, even if you don't think that we need them all to be implemented at this one moment in Israel. But thank you so much, Hanna Lerner, talking about her recent book and other articles co-authored with Asla Bali, Constitution Writing, Religion and Democracy. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks also to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.